Washington, Russian Embassy. The beautiful Soviet Commissioner Tamara Zhaglova invites Indiana Jones to take part in an expedition to Outer Mongolia. It concerns an old legend. And what could happen if the legend is true? If the Sword of Khan is found, according to the tale, the Mongol Empire will be resurrected to its former size. The wild hordes are ready. A risky venture awaits Indy with enemies from all nations. Russians, Chinese, Germans, and Japanese. One thing is clear, however. You can't escape adventure. And so begins a wild hunt across the continents. In Indiana Jones and the Sword of Genghis Khan.
Hello and welcome back to this damn idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be discussing the fourth in the series of Wolfgang Holbein written German Indiana Jones novels from the early 1990s. This was a series of 8 officially licensed novels that otherwise has never been published in English in any sort of official translation. So what I'm reading are the beautiful fan translations that have been done and posted for free online, which I'll leave links to in the description. And of course, it should be stressed that you always have to keep in mind that these are fan labors of love, and so they are not the original German text. So you do have to always keep that in mind because you might run into something that might throw you a little bit, or something that was just caused in the translation process. And it should be stressed that different books were done by different fans in different ways. Some were translated by German speakers. Some, like this one, were done with the assistance of online translators. So again, there is some variation, but overall, it's just a wonderful experience to be able to dive into these. And I would recommend any indie fan who's not good at reading German and doesn't have the rare, hard-to-find German paperbacks from the early 1990s, I would recommend trying out this beautiful fan translation. So, of course, the fourth novel in the series is Indiana Jones and the Sword of Genghis Khan. It's a great title and, of course, has the great MacGuffin of trying to find the lost Khan's sword. And the legend here in this book and pretty much most pulp stories where you see some form of Khan's tomb or sword or mask is supposed to give someone the power to reunite the Mongol army and ostensibly take over all of Asia once more. Now, the reason why I mentioned mask is reading this and having that as the sort of MacGuffin, it immediately reminds one of The Mask of Fu Manchu, both the Sax Rohmer Source novel and, of course, the infamous MGM pre-code 1932 film starring Boris Karloff, where that was the MacGuffin of the story and what Fu Manchu was after and what Nayland Smith was out to prevent Fu Manchu from gaining access to and ostensibly being able to perhaps upset the balance of power in the entire world. So this is essentially an adventure that is a race story, or it should be a race between multiple parties to obtain the artifact. The fun part of this story is really, I think, the setup and getting Indiana Jones involved. We open with Indy being sort of out of his element at a cocktail party amongst not only foreign diplomats and rich donors to museums and such, but actually an entire contingent of Soviet diplomats. And they seem to have an interest in our favorite archaeology professor, as he is confronted by the beautiful Tamara Zhaglova, who is the sort of love interest of this story, or the potential love interest for Indy to banter with, at least throughout the opening sections. And she is the one who presents the case of the lost sword of Genghis Khan supposedly being uncovered, as we see in an extended opening. An entire Soviet tank force is essentially thwarted by what seems to be an unstoppable horde of Mongols on horseback in a wintry landscape. So this, like the other Holbein books, opens with a sort of cold open without featuring Indiana Jones, and thankfully it's nicely contained, as some of these opening sequences in this series can go on for way too long, as we saw in the second book, Longship of the Gods. But that's the sort of setup, and then we have a nice sort of expository scene of Indy being informed of what could potentially be at the the end of this quest and how important that would be, and that, of course, other factions are already out to get it. Most notably, a villainous Chinese general named Qiu Din, who looks to potentially be the villain of the piece, but unfortunately is barely in the book. Nicely, this expository scene is actually interrupted not only by an attack sequence on the party, but also it is then turned into a bomb sequence where Indy and Tamara have to defuse a time bomb and do so just by the skin of their teeth, while nicely bantering all the while. And Tamara is very clearly not telling Indiana Jones everything. Indy decides to become involved anyway, and interestingly and most amusingly, against the wishes of both Marcus Brody, who advises him not to get involved, and the federal government, who doesn't want Indiana Jones, an American citizen, getting involved in a Soviet operation in the Far East, despite of what sort of global implications it might have. They just don't want him to get involved for political reasons. So Indy essentially decides, screw it, I'm going to do it anyway, because there might be a chance of finding the lost sword of Khan. Whether it has any magical properties or not, I don't care. I want it because I'm an archaeologist. And so he has to get both himself and Tamara out of the United States and off to the Far East without anyone, including the federal government, knowing. Things are complicated further because of the attacks. It is very clear that someone in the Soviet diplomatic group of Tamara's has it out for her and Indiana Jones and doesn't want them to obtain Khan's sword. So Indy has to spirit themselves out of the United States and not get killed doing so. This is made more difficult by the fact that they begin to be pursued by seemingly a group of Mongol warriors who appear in the U.S., and we have another sort of inherent cliche of these Holbein books where Indy has to fight against a seeming unstoppable giant of an opponent. This happens in at least two different places in this book, but this particular giant warrior is, like we see in all these fight sequences, seemingly unstoppable, and Indy has to be his usual scrappy best to barely survive. And there's a nice bit of back and forth between Indy and Tamara, because apparently she also is not only skilled in the realm of archaeology, but also has some martial arts skills, which Indy is very pleasantly surprised by. So the whole opening of the book really consists with this sort of setup sequence and getting Indy and Tamara not only acquainted and going through several scrapes, but having to find a secret way out of the country. I really like the opening of this book, and I like the Tamara character. I like her banter with Indy. I like their dynamic. But unfortunately, at least for me, the book really starts to lose steam literally when they get on board a long-term ship journey to get from the United States to the Far East and get to China. It is rather odd that for a quest that should be about racing other parties to get to the location of potentially obtaining the sword of Genghis Khan, that Indy decides to take a slow boat journey that then takes even longer than he expected. And then we just kind of skip over it after we get them on the ship and have a nice little scene of potential flirtation and romantic interest. And then suddenly it just jumps to, oh, damn it took over 30 days. I thought it was only going to take 27 days. Well, we're here now. So I think the biggest problem of this book is that there's no sense of it being a race to find the artifact before other parties get to it. And even though the notion of this Chinese general being the potential villain of the story, that's never fulfilled or really fleshed out, because that character really doesn't appear until the very end of the book, and even that is fleeting. Once our characters get to their destination, they are very quickly confronted by a Japanese character who goes under the name of Moto, which might be an allusion to the famous Mr. Moto character, but that may be just my own love of that film series sort of playing into it. But he is essentially a very mysterious character with obvious motives of his own, who sort of latches himself on to Indy and Tamara, and is very much aware that they are on this quest to find Khan's sword, and basically is Well, he's not the villain of the entire book, but he essentially is. The rest of the book is them going around various locales, inching closer and closer to the sword of Khan, while it is very obvious that Moto has intentions of his own and wants the sword for himself, and straight up tells Indy on multiple occasions that he will kill him. So it's an uneasy alliance to say the least, but if anyone is the villain of this story, it is actually this Moto character. Just after this point, Tamara is essentially kidnapped by the Chinese forces working under the evil general and is never really seen again for the rest of the book, which is another major problem. You lose any sense of romance and flirtatious banter between her and Indy. She's a really nice character that the reader comes to enjoy, and so the rest of the book has Indy always focused on trying to rescue her just as much, if not more, than actually obtaining Khan's sword. This, unfortunately, is a plot thread that doesn't really go anywhere because, again, she only really reappears at the very end of the book, and by that time, the book is over. So for her to suddenly no longer be a presence in the book, I think is a real misfortune, as she is sorely missed, and that's usually the one thing you see said in the reviews about this book. Everyone can pretty much agree that the Tamara character should not have been just basically removed from the book after a certain point. Then from this point onward, the book very much becomes episodic, which is an issue that I think crops up in some of the past Holbein novels in this series. It essentially becomes a back and forth between Indiana Jones and the Moto character as they get closer and closer to the supposed location of the sword. And other characters get introduced here and there. They get in and out of one scrape after another. Most of them are caused by Moto not trusting Indy and Indy not trusting Moto, but for whatever reason, they stay together. Sometimes they are driven apart. Sometimes Moto is trying to kill Indy, but they are always brought back together. That is something you can milk a lot of drama out, a sort of uneasy alliance with someone obviously trying to kill the hero or outthink them at any moment. But it gets old after a while when that's really all that happens. They are, of course, introduced to elements of the Japanese army, and it is revealed that Moto is some sort of high-ranking secret official and has direct ties to the Emperor of Japan. So that at least gives him more credibility. Then we are further introduced to essentially what seems like two characters who are some sort of priest out of somewhere in Nepal, and this indicates where the story will eventually wind up, somewhere in the Himalayas, with very much vibes of Lost Horizon, as the Sword of Khan is apparently somewhere in the lost city of Shambhala. It's not Shangri-La here in the story, but it's Shambhala, which, given the action in the final act and the location, actually gives this story some elements of the classic game Uncharted 2, which is the most Indiana Jones game there is that isn't actually Indiana Jones. So fans of the Uncharted series will definitely get something out of the final act of this book. But most of the book, after that really nice opening, is just Indy and the Moto character going back and forth and then being introduced to the sort of Tibetan priests who seem to have certain magical abilities. Sometimes they use on Indiana Jones, who has to utilize these powers, and yet another fight with a seemingly giant, unstoppable foe. We then transition into the Himalayas, where there are multiple action sequences piled on top of one another, and then a really nice set piece where Indy and one of the priests is in one plane, low on fuel, flying into the Himalayas towards the lost city of Shambhala that only the priest knows the location of and can't admit it to outsiders. And then the other plane that's following them, also low on fuel, is Moto, prepared to shoot them down at any minute unless they lead him to Shambhala in the next 5 minutes, because they're both going to run out of fuel. So it's got a number of great set pieces, but they're not as fulfilling as they could be because the plot in between the action set pieces is not very clear or consistent. I don't know if this is tied to the translation, not making it as clear from the original German text, but I should also mention that in terms of this translation, while it was great to read and well done, it did have a number of points where I thought the text was a bit unclear, And because this is one of the ones that was done using online translation, I don't know if that probably may have played into this. And also the formatting of this as an ebook, sometimes it's hard to follow because sometimes, unfortunately, it moves some lines of dialogue and character text into other paragraphs. So there were a number of instances when I was reading this book where I had to really focus more intently on certain passages because the flow would get interrupted by maybe a particular word choice, or especially because the actual formatting was seemingly a bit off. So unfortunately, that's just stuff that I think you're going to run into with a project like this that is entirely done by fans as a labor of love, having to use online translators and things. So some of these translations, I think you can tell, are having to work a bit harder and done with a different sort of methodology. It doesn't distract the reader. It's still an enjoyable experience, but it didn't really help my experience when I wasn't already being as engaged by the plotting, which unfortunately I think becomes very episodic. As I said, the sort of Tibetan priests do have some magical abilities or elements of the supernatural that they're able to call upon. It's not overdone, thankfully, though, so I don't think it ever goes too far into that realm as the frankly crazy Longship of the Gods did in this series. So I'm okay with it. Again, it's hard to not make connections to the sort of finale of Uncharted 2. So if you're familiar with that game series, that's, I think, the best description for what you get in terms of flavor in the final act of this book. So essentially, our characters eventually do make it to Shambhala, and then by that point, the book has very few pages left. And so in the last couple of pages, we suddenly have the Chinese general there with his forces who have decimated through the priests whose mission is to guard the city of Shambhala and guard the sword of Khan from falling into the wrong hands. Then Moto is there, and Indy is there, and Tamara is there, and everybody comes together in the last couple of pages, and Indy tries to obtain the sword at all costs. So unfortunately, the climax is extremely rushed, and then there's basically a little tiny postscript on the last page or two. I wish the book had gotten to this point much sooner. I wish there hadn't been so much back and forth between Indy and Moto, and so much of the journey into the Himalayas and then getting to Shambhala. I think it would have been better and more fulfilling had we spent more time not only in the lost city of Shambhala itself, but also with the Chinese general, who should technically be, if not the main villain, one of the main villains, with the other being Moto as the sort of duplicitous villain behind everything. It's just not as developed as I thought it was going to be. And unfortunately, I don't think the book lives up to how strong the opening is. And on top of that, you once again have the peculiar sort of structuring of these books, where you'll have chapters that are extraordinarily short, sometimes only a page or two, and then other chapters that are extraordinarily long, as if they've been extended to fill out a page count. So you have a chapter that's maybe 2 or 3 pages or 5 pages, and then you have a chapter that's like 30, 40, 50 pages, and that does throw off the pacing, I think, if you're somebody who notices how long a chapter might be. So again, I think my major criticisms of this book are that the love interest is nicely done, but then just basically disappears for the rest of the book and only shows up in the last few pages. I think the climax is far too rushed, and I think we should have spent the whole final act in Shambhala. I think we spend way too long getting there, and there is far too much back and forth between Indy and Moto. I think that could have been condensed down, and thus we get to spend more time in the Lost City with the actual sword, and Indy trying to get the sword out of the villain's grasp and rescue the love interest. So again, my main issue seems to be structure and development here, which is something I've had an issue with in the past 3 books. But at least I think there's enough really good elements here and enough really great set pieces and great action to give you the flavor of the original trilogy of films. Indy does sound and act like we think of Harrison Ford's characterization, so everything seems on point. it's just that it's like a car trying to get up the hill, and the one that never quite gets there. You keep hoping it will. You keep reading along in this book, hoping that that you're going to get that spark for the engine to start, and it never quite does. There's moments where you have in the great action set pieces and some of the interplay between Indy and Moto or Indy and Tamara, where things are working and you're engaged with the material, and then it just kind of loses track of what it's doing, and frankly, your mind wanders throughout sections of this book. It's never bad. It's never completely boring, but it was a book that I did have to really focus on to finish. And I felt it was definitely not as good as the third book, Gold of El Dorado, which I really did enjoy, even though it also had some of these same issues, which seem to be part of this overall series, as each of the four I've read so far have some of the same structural and development issues. But overall, I did enjoy Sword of Genghis Khan. I enjoyed some of the ideas. I enjoyed the MacGuffin, which is a classical pulp MacGuffin if there ever was one, as it is essentially the same MacGuffin as we saw in not only Mask of Fu Manchu, but even in some ways similar to the MacGuffin of the masterpiece Drums of Fu Manchu serial from Republic. So it's a classical pulp adventure story with Indiana Jones with a classical pulp adventure MacGuffin. It has great elements, it has great set pieces, it has nice action, it has good tone, but unfortunately I don't think the plotting is up to par, and it has some of the same structural issues. But once again, the love interest should not disappear and then not return until the last 5 pages, and the climax is far too rushed, so it just feels like you go through the whole book and you just get the last maybe 10 to 15 pages is the whole climax, and you finish it and you're like, that's it? I read this whole book and that's all we get? So unfortunately, I was left with a feeling of at least some disappointment in aspects, but overall it's still an enjoyable read, just not as good as the previous book in the series. But again, I should stress that this still has some nice Indiana Jones moments. There's some nice moments with the whip, of course. There is some nice banter with Tamara when she's actually around. There is some nice interplay with the Moto character. There is some nice interplay with the Tibetan priest, although there are some seemingly random, totally unnecessary character deaths in this book of side characters. There is the Lost City of Shambhala, there is the Sword of Khan, and there's even an appearance by Yeti in some fashion, which, as out there as that might seem, is actually really well done, and I love what Holbein did with it. And again, there are some really great action set pieces that would work perfectly in a film, and throughout the book, Indy almost dies many times, so you do at least get the grit of the adventure, which I really appreciate, because you need that in an Indy story so badly. But unfortunately, I just don't think the book overall adds up as well as Gold of El Dorado did, and it does feel unsatisfying in a number of areas. To talk about the cover art, we of course again have a beautiful painted rendering of Indy based on one of the stills from the film. So it's a really lovely artist rendering of Harrison Ford with the Sword of Khan here. Each of these books has something symbolizing the quest or the MacGuffin over a nice landscape background, and then we have some of the tents of one of the encampments that's depicted in the second and third acts of the book. So it's a really nicely done cover. All of these are a bit more on the subtle side, but they're all done to have a uniform matching aesthetic. So each of the books go together in terms of their cover artwork. But I really like how well detailed the paintings of Harrison Ford are in these. And this one really looks nice with the sort of sunset fading into the background, and the sword blade of Khan sort of right under Harrison Ford's face. It really looks nice. So overall, I did enjoy elements of Indiana Jones and the Sword of Genghis Khan. I do think that this being one of the fan translations that apparently was done using online translators means that maybe the text in some areas doesn't flow as well as the ones that were translated by actual German speakers. But again, that is nothing against the wonderful efforts of the fans behind these translations, who also made them freely available for us to read and pick apart and analyze and stuff. Again, my hat's off to them, and it must have been even more difficult as a non-German speaker to translate these. But again, I do think that does play into the reading experience a little bit, in terms of just how some of the formatting and word choice was a little harder to discern in a couple areas. Again, nothing major, but I did have to focus a little bit more, or reread a few passages here and there. But that also kind of, I think, plays into some of my issues with the plotting and overall development. So that didn't really help matters. I did like a number of the elements in this story, and I liked the MacGuffin, of course, and the opening most of all, which promised a really nice adventure that unfortunately I don't think it really fulfilled. It had all the right elements, but I just think it took way too long to get to the final act, which was then over in a few pages, and we didn't really have any development with the Chinese general villain, and also some of the things we see in the opening and scattered throughout the book with other characters were never fully defined. So it does leave the reader hanging, I think, in a number of areas. It's still a pleasant reading experience. It still has a number of great, fun indie moments, and I think lovers of classic pulp fiction or other genres will recognize elements that will remind them of Lost Horizon, or, of course, The Mask of Fu Manchu, or Drums of Fu Manchu, and then gamers will obviously recognize elements that seem very similar to Uncharted 2's final act in Shambhala. So there's something for every adventure lover in ways. But of the 4 in this series I've read so far, this is probably my second or third favorite. I don't think it's as good as Gold of El Dorado, and it's between this and Feathered Serpent as my second favorite so far. And then last is the frankly bonkers Longship of the Gods, which goes off the rails halfway through. So this is a fun experience. I would recommend to all indie fans to check out these German translations now that we have these beautiful fan efforts that have been made freely available. I will leave links to them in the description below so you can check them out yourself. I encourage all indie fans to check them out, as they're full of parallels to the official American Bantam and Del Rey novels, but interestingly, these predate those. So that makes them rather unique in that they're a sort of side thing that is officially licensed, but apparently no one here in the US actually looked at them, because none of the American authors really had ever read them or knew much about them. And I don't know if anyone at Lucasfilm ever even read the German novels. I think they just approved this as a project of 8 novels and then just kind of forgot about it. But they are officially licensed, and most fans do consider them, at least to some degree, as parts of the official indie canon. So they are important, and I would recommend them as a reading experience to all indie fans now that these beautiful translations are available, due entirely to the wonderful efforts of fellow indie fans. So as always, I hope my babblings about the printed world of our favorite intrepid archaeologist, Indiana Jones, have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I will continue reading these wonderful translations as I make my way through all the other indie stories in, of course, books and tie-ins and comics as well. So I just never thought I'd get to read these, since my German is practically non-existent, the books are very rare, and they've never been officially translated. So these are wonderful treasures to dive into, even if some you don't enjoy as much as others. It's still something fresh and exciting for us indie fans to dig into, especially if you're like me and you were not, shall we say, thrilled with how Dial of Destiny turned out. This is a really nice, fresh experience to have a new indie adventure. So definitely keep reading, keep cracking the whip, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.